How about that? Okay, and we are, oh my goodness, some of my people already up. All right, Bernadette, hey, hey, hey. We're up in five. Well, no, well, let's give it another five, four. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. You know, I've got my guy, Bryce Greene, here from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And we're going to talk about the international scene. We've been talking about that the past few days, but they loom so large. We really thought, well, at least some people thought they were voting for a peaceful era. A president who said, a candidate who said that he was not going to have wars and wars abound. So, what is going on? Let's talk about that here on the Santita Jackson Show with Bryce Greene. But as we do, I want you to please go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, like and subscribe there, and please share the show. The Santita Jackson and Friends page on Facebook, and share the show. I also share it with Reverend Jesse Jackson's page. Like and share the show. And if you want to be my friend on Facebook, I can only accept new friends at Santita Jackson and Friends. That's my fan page. I have to have a fan page because they've topped out on my friends page and they keep kicking all of you off. That's not something that I'm doing. That's what Facebook does when you reach a limit, when you reach a certain number. So please, please, I want to be your friend. I'm at Santita J on X and Santita Jackson IG, Blue Sky Santita Jackson. Oh, my goodness, I'm everywhere, including behind this cough. So let's get to it because there is a lot for us to talk about. And everyone, I need you to like the show, share the show. You help us with the algorithm. I'm finding that I'm grateful to you because Bryce, we're looking up and I see the cumulative views for many of the shows going to the millions. 1.5, 2, 3 million. You all are liking and sharing the show. And what I appreciate is that it gives us a sense of appreciation for what we try to give you on the show, that you share the show for days on end. So these are topics that you really want to hear profound discussions about. And so, hey, we do it for you. And I hope you'll meet me on this on the Keep Hope Alive with Reverend Jesse Jackson show on the iHeart Network. That's our nationally syndicated show. I'm hosting it now. I've been producing it and writing it since the beginning. And we're going to be spinning it off into a podcast. We're going to stay on terrestrial radio, but it'll be a podcast as well. And I'm going to snag Bryce Greene onto that too. But we're going to marry current voices to vintage Reverend Jesse Jackson. We've got about 20 years of his voice and so many things that he has stood for down through the years. He has been right on the Palestinian issue, Israeli security, Palestinian justice. He's been right about the housing crisis, student loan debt, everything, the emergence of China, the emergence of Africa, India. He has been on the case for 60 years. And again, as I shared with you yesterday, the Chinese ambassador to the United States flew in from Washington to give greetings to him, Bryce Greene. He said, you know, just on behalf of our government and the people of China, we want to thank you for all the work that you've done down through the years to make peace, to lift us all up. And my mother and Congressman Jackson, my brother, and I, and really at my father's behest, wanted to thank them for what they have been doing to really continue to try to have a good relationship with our government, but what they've been doing in Africa for decades now. They have had really a healthy relationship with Africa. A wonderful exchange, and we wanted to thank them and just really thank them for honoring Reverend Jackson's work, which is why, you know, people look, Bryce Greene, at our struggle in the United States, and what we've been doing means so much to them, to people who've been looking for sovereignty and who've been looking for peace and freedom all over the world. We don't know how this little 4.5% of the world, and really the subset, the African American, who've been leading the progressive charge in the United States, Bryce, for hundreds of years. People have been looking to us all over the world to give them the example of nonviolent social change, to show them how to face down empire and win. So just know that you got to keep up the fight, everybody. And of course, tomorrow we will be talking about the race in Tennessee. Will Afton Bain win? Will she place and show? Who knows? Who knows? The fact that she is in it says a whole lot, everybody. We can't wait to really break that race down tomorrow. But as for today, let's talk with Bryce Greene. We want to talk about Venezuela, Somalia. Really need to look at this Ukraine peace deal. Will we get an armistice agreement or will we get a peace treaty? We will have to see. Before we get there, it's always wonderful to have you here, Bryce Greene.
It's always good to be here, Santita.
At the Greene BJ. Now remember, Greene is with an E. Greene is with an E. And please subscribe on Substack. Follow him on all of these social media platforms. He will engage you. So watch it. So help me to understand, what are we looking at with Venezuela? It seems like it's a case of hot potato. No one wants to touch what could be, what appears to be. Look, it's a war crime. That's what it appears to be. And no one really wants to touch it. And it's very interesting. We all know that war, as David Swanson from World Beyond War said on the show yesterday, war is a crime because you're killing people. So let's just keep it right there. And I love our troops, and they're doing what they've been instructed to do, but we need to find another way to resolve conflict, everybody. We need to do that, and we can. That having been said, what are we looking at with Venezuela? I mean, this has the potential to destabilize not just Venezuela, not just South and Central America, but really this hemisphere. Because I don't think it would stop in Venezuela, Bryce.
Right. Yeah, there are a few levels of what's going on here. Right now in the news, what we're seeing is a scandal being made out of the fact that on one of the first strikes that the Trump administration made on these migrant boats, these Venezuelan boats, these civilian boats, they're labeling them, narco terrorists. On one of the first strikes, there was actually a double tap done by the U.S. military, in which the survivors of that initial strike were then killed by U.S. munitions. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not it was legal to do a second strike. But to me, it's a very weird discussion because it's really narrowing the lens of what's happening over there. It's asking the question: was this second strike an early strike on this single Venezuelan boat, was that a war crime, and was it legal? And did Pete Hegseth have the ability to do it? Well, I mean, if you've been paying attention to this thing, it's a bizarre thing to focus on, because not only is the second strike obviously illegal, but the first strike was obviously illegal. And so was the second boat that they targeted, and the third, and the fourth, and the 10th, and the 20th boat. They've targeted well over 20 boats in both in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. None of them, they had evidence to say that they were in any way endangering the U.S. And even if they were narco terrorists, like the Trump administration alleged, that's not an executable offense. And even if it was, you still need a judge and a jury. So this thing is illegal on so many levels, and it's bizarre to me that the media and the political class has taken this very narrow focus on this second strike from 2 months ago. The crisis is really ongoing because it seems to be indicative of the Trump administration's goal to go into Venezuela to some way affect regime change. This had been their goal since the first time that they were in office. And in fact, under the Obama administration, relations were icy. And before that, under Bush, the relationship with Hugo Chavez was very hostile. But under Trump 1, the sanctions regime against Venezuela was dramatically escalated. There was a failed invasion sponsored by U.S. Marines. National Endowment for Democracy was pouring a lot of money into different opposition groups. They tried to declare a president of Venezuela Juan Guaido, who was someone who was deeply unpopular in Venezuela and hadn't even, won the election. The Americans weren't even alleging that he won the election. It's been, a nonstop assault on Venezuela for quite some time. But the Trump administration, Trump 2 administration, is really ramping up the attacks. According to reporting, the Trump administration, Trump himself, actually was very hesitant to get more involved in Venezuela, which is in line with what we know to be his initial instincts on these sorts of things. But the typical lines about Venezuela supporting sending migrants to America, supporting anti-U.S. regimes in the Southern Hemisphere. That didn't seem to work on Trump. But according to the reporting, as I said, Marco Rubio convinced Trump to more deeply engage in Venezuela by invoking the specter of these narco terrorists, by alleging that Venezuela and the Maduro government specifically is at the center of a drug cartel called the Cartel de la Sol, the Cartel of the Sun. They're alleging that Maduro is a kingpin in this drug empire. No evidence, of course, to support this. None whatsoever. They're just making things up, in part to get Trump to authorize the bombing, but in part to mobilize the general public. So what does the U.S. want in Venezuela? I think that's one of the core questions to have here. Well, since Hugo Chavez, a socialist president, was elected in Venezuela, and was governing and implementing social reforms throughout the early 2000s, very successful social reforms, the U.S. was very upset at that. They didn't want the idea of a government that could exist outside of the U.S. influence being successful, demonstrating to the world that there is a way to exist outside of the auspices of the U.S. empire. They didn't like that one bit. And once Chavez was gone, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, has been in charge of Venezuela more or less ever since. So Venezuela, the fact that they're able to exist outside of the U.S. umbrella is one transgression that the U.S. will never forgive. The other thing that the U.S. wants in Venezuela is, a tale as old as time: oil. Venezuela has the second largest oil reserves on the planet. And if we're talking about grand geopolitical strategy, this grand chessboard that we all have to be thinking about, well, if you control the oil, if you control these hydrocarbons, that gives you an edge. Simple as that. And if your enemy controls it, if someone hostile to you controls it, well, that gives them an edge. So if you're an American planner, I mean, the goal is simple. You want to control these strategic resources, and you can leave it to the public relations people to think up a justification for the American public. And that's what we're seeing now. These bombings on these boats are really just a prelude. The Trump administration has been, they've been talking to Nicolas Maduro. They've been saying the only way that you are going to survive this is if you and your family get out of the country now. Mm-hmm. That's what they're saying. Maduro has been willing to negotiate. He's been saying, well, I'm willing to talk about some, oil rights for American companies. I'm willing to talk, about, peace deal. In fact, Maduro is still assisting the Trump administration by accepting the migrant flights, the deportation flights coming out of America and into Venezuela.
So ultimately, this is about, because when you have these people become socialist because our capitalism, in our capitalism, we have taken their resources and impoverished their people. So these populists come in and they impose Social Security. They impose Medicare for all. They impose a public school system, which are all socialist concepts, Bryce Greene, right? That's why they're called socialists, right? And so, ultimately, and they use the vast riches that their oil can provide, just as Gaddafi did in Libya, very, very successfully. And we don't like that, because the other side of that is that we put the American companies, the British companies, the European companies cannot make the monies that they had made before, right? So is this really about the oil, ultimately?
In a very real sense, yes, it is ultimately about the oil. But I mean, the only reason that the oil is so critical is because the U.S. wants to dominate the world. I mean that's the simplest way to put it. And I was wrong earlier. One of your commenters mentioned Venezuela does not have the second largest oil reserves in the world. They have the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, and you know that's critically important. But I mean, if you go back in American history, you will see that the oil majors have an inordinate amount of influence on the way America directs its foreign policy. I mean, go back and look at one of the first acknowledged CIA coups
Mhm.
in the post-war era. It was against Mossadegh in Iran. Iran had just had its first democratic election and elected, a pretty moderate social democrat, Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize the oil, which was then controlled almost entirely by British corporations. And their government started, taking the profits of the hydrocarbon industry and investing them in the country rather than having them go to the UK. Well, UK oil companies, they were very upset about this, and they started talking to their friends in America, and eventually they all settled on a policy of how to get their oil money back, and it was overthrowing the government in Iran. And that's how you get Operation Ajax, and that's how they installed the Shah, the king that was in charge until the revolution of 1979. So this is a core part of American foreign policies to control these strategic resources, but it's for the purpose of engaging in geopolitical contests. And so if Venezuela is, leftist or uh, critical of empire, well, that puts them automatically in the BRICS camp. That puts them in the world of non-Western countries who want to have a say in how the world is run. Puts them along with Russia, with China, Iran, and others. Uh, well, if you're America and you're trying to game out how you dominate the world, well, that's a problem. You want to pry Venezuela away from that block. And one of the ways that they can do it, because it's in our hemisphere, it's in our quote unquote backyard, is to regime change. And there are many ways to affect regime change. As I mentioned, the sanctions policy that's been in place for decades. That's one way that American planners try to regime change. They try and make conditions in the country so bad that the people there decide that they want to overthrow their government. And they say this explicitly. This was the goal of the sanctions under the first Trump administration. They were trying to say that, oh, Maduro's running his country into the ground and the people yearn for American intervention. Meanwhile, the sanctions were making everything all the worse, while on the political side, the Americans were trying to say that Juan Guaido was the president the whole time. I mean, it's ridiculous. But yes, overall, it is largely about the oil.
Very quickly, before we wrap this particular issue up, well, certainly put a pin in it until the next time, because we don't know what'll happen between twixt and between now and next week. Where do you see this going? Do you think that Pete Hegseth is in the hot seat because they want to get rid of him? Is it because the president has very low poll numbers? Uh, what do you think is the reason? Because this has been going on. This is not new.
Right. No, nothing here is new at all. This agenda has been on the books, like I said, for decades.
Mhm.
But the question is interesting. Why is it that this story about this second strike is coming out now and having this impact? It's very clear that people in the American government and in Congress and the military, they don't care about murdering people, right? They don't care if America drone strikes a boat full of, children. They don't care. They don't care if Israel, bombs a building full of children. They don't care. So whenever an act of war by the U.S. becomes a scandal, we should pay attention because it means that someone is upset about something. They're not usually upset about all the death, not usually upset about all the killing, but they're upset about something. And I think the fact that this scandal is touching Pete Hegseth right now means that there are some people somewhere who are interested in maybe stopping the US momentum to invade or bomb or otherwise regime
Mhm.
change in Venezuela. And, if you're an empire planner, there are all sorts of reasons why you could disagree with your counterparts who want a more aggressive policy in Venezuela. If you like the American empire, there are all sorts of reasons why invading Venezuela might actually harm that goal. It makes you look terrible. It actually exacerbates the migrant crisis that a lot of them claim to care about. It, of course, destabilizes the region, which causes all sorts of knock-on effects. Maybe in a crazy heating up world, maybe that's not what we need to keep America on top. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a faction somewhere that is, pushing this as an issue with the opportunity to slow or forestall Pete Hegseth and the Trump administration's attack on Venezuela. And we know that attack is coming, right? Like we know that they are talking about it. The press has been all over this. They've been saying that Trump has been briefed about various options about attacking Iran, of attacking Venezuela. They've talked about a full just ground invasion full of special forces. They've talked about a Libya-style intervention where they just bomb from above while Contras on the ground handle all the hand-to-hand on the ground fighting. They've talked about simply just trying to send in some guys to assassinate Maduro and hoping that the military comes on side. These are real plans that they are working about. In fact, they just had a big meeting about it yesterday. That's what's on the table. The only way it's going to stop is if someone or something politically changes the momentum. Perhaps this strike is one way to change the momentum, or the stories about this strike is one way to change the momentum. And if that's the case, then we can only hope that they're successful. Give the Venezuelans a little bit longer to breathe. But if the stone is not arrested, then it's going to crash into Venezuela and be a total disaster. And there's no reason to think that it'll be a simple task to dismantle the Venezuelan state and the government. There's no reason to think. In fact, Elliot Abrams, who listeners may know and love from Iran-Contra days or from the first Trump administration's war against Venezuela, but Abrams just had an article in Foreign Affairs talking about how easy it would be to take out Maduro and how essential it is to take out Maduro. The only way that those people are gonna stop is if something really, really pushes the Trump administration to rethink all of this.
Well, it certainly is a bit of hubris to think that that Venezuela and that Venezuelans in the 21st century would take kindly to being treated in such a disrespectful way. I think, we did that with Vietnam and we did not learn from that. And then we went in there and then we had to leave. Afghanistan, we went in and we had to leave. So we had to leave because we were losing. We haven't
Exactly.
we lost. So what about Somalia? Why are we there? I know the pushback against AFRICOM, the African Command Center, our military, a node on the African continent. The person who pushed back against that successfully was Gaddafi. By taking him out, the dominoes began to fall, right? So help me to understand why Somalia, why now? Because the president is criticizing Somalia and he's sending them air support. I don't get it.
Well, we ask, why Somalia? Why now? Well, it's not just now, right? We have bombed this year alone Somalia, as of yesterday, 102 times. And almost none of these have been reported in the American media, but the bombings continue. Now, ostensibly, we are supporting the Somalian government against, ISIS or Al-Qaeda-linked jihadists in the country. But with these bombings, we have no idea. The AFRICOM can say whatever they want, and as we've seen, human rights organizations have routinely pointed out that Americans lie or misrepresent or just simply omit the number of civilian casualties that their bombings cause. And so this has been going on for quite some time. The Trump administration's 102 number is just the highest one. It's just the one that's ramping up now. Because the Biden administration bombed them dozens of times. The first Trump administration bombed them dozens of times. The Bush administration bombed them dozens of times. And I believe the Clinton administration also bombed them dozens of times. But the real ramp up of Somalia, it came in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? When America had the unipolar moment and was trying to expand its influence all around the world. Somalia, if you look at a map, is at a very critical juncture in the in global trade routes and geopolitics in general. There's a military base or there's an airfield that the American military uses there to carry out strikes. It's why the image of Somali pirates has been so important or looms large in in the American cultural psyche. It's because, well, if you're in Somalia, uh, all of the world shipping that's going through the Suez Canal is going right by Somalia. And so uh, after the collapse of the USSR, and after um, the U.S. had this moment where it could basically dictate what it wanted around the world, and especially after 9/11 provided a justification for an increased ramped up military. Well, the U.S. decided to expand its global war on terror to all sorts of countries. I'm sure you're all familiar with the memo that was described to us by General Wesley Clark, who was talking about how the neocons in Washington were planning to attack 7 countries in 5 years.
Mhm.
And if we look at what actually happened in the decade or so since that memo was reported, all 7 of those countries have been attacked. That's it's Libya, it's Sudan, it's Somalia, it's Iraq, it's all these countries that we've seen at the forefront of the global war on terror. It was planned, and that's because the American military wanted to have influence over these strategic areas and also have forward-facing American bases so that they could intervene in the world if needed. That's why Somalia is being targeted. That's one of the reasons that all these places are being targeted. That's one of the reasons why we were in Syria, why we were in Libya, why we continue to bomb like Yemen, all these countries around the world. It's because of the strategic plan to control uh, and affect global geopolitics and global resources. And so the fact that this isn't being even discussed as an issue is really striking to me, because bombing a country 100 times seems like something that might be a kitchen table issue. But maybe I'm living in fairy tale land where murdering people is considered something that's worthy of note. That if your government's out there murdering people, maybe you want to know why. Maybe you think that they should have to provide some sort of serious justification. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just silly.
I don't know, but they don't put faces on the people of Venezuela. They don't put faces on people in Central and South America and the Caribbean and in Africa.
Well,
Uh,
they put one face on it, right? They put
one.
Maduro's face on it,
That's
and
it.
then they tell you that he's the devil, or that he's Hitler, or what have you. So then you'll justify bombing them,
Well, and they have regimes. They don't have governments.
right?
I mean, it's just, oh my goodness. Well, which brings us to, because we're at the center of that, we're at the center of Venezuela, Somalia, for example, now Ukraine. And this is how you and I met. Um, Talking about Ukraine,
Hmm.
where are we? Where are we with Ukraine? Who is negotiating this? Are we looking for a peace treaty, or are we looking for an armistice agreement? And there is a difference, right? Are we looking for a cessation of
Right.
hostilities, or are we looking for peace?
That's a very good question. And regardless of what Americans have proposed, there's a serious question about whether or not they're serious about anything, whether or not they're serious about peace or an armistice agreement. But what's been proposed is a 28-point plan in which Ukraine does not join NATO, territory is ceded from Ukraine to Russia, and sovereignty over Crimea is Russian sovereignty over Crimea is recognized. Now, if you've been paying attention to Ukraine for the last decade, or any amount of time before the war, you'd realize that these were the things that Russia had been demanding for quite some time, or had been talking about negotiating or finding some sort of agreement with for quite some time, especially the NATO question. Ever since 2008, the Russians have been clear that they don't want Ukraine to join NATO. And then ever since the U.S. overthrew the government in 2014, they have said that there should be some degree of autonomy for the Donbass regions, and a Crimea was to be Russian. Now, since the war started, those lists of demands have expanded, right? As Russia has degraded Ukrainian military capabilities, naturally the demands of the war increase. And so that's why you get all this other stuff about rebuilding Ukraine, or about the territorial concessions, about what that post-war political order is going to look like. But the Trump administration and the Biden administration before it has been very resistant to engaging on these issues. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians, especially the Ukrainian government and Zelensky and his allies, they've been very hesitant to discuss any sort of serious deal. And so this Trump plan that has been proposed, and who knows how much Trump had anything to do with it. I mean, could you imagine? But this Trump plan that was proposed is a step in the right direction, and Putin actually acknowledged that.
Well, wait. I think you bring up the point. I don't want to go past that. Would you say, can I imagine? I'm trying to figure out who is constructing the deal and what their interests are, right? Because I'm still trying to figure out, I don't know if Americans, I don't think we have really gotten a good reason for being there.
Right. Well, if you remember the start of the war, the justification for American involvement was that we need to protect Ukraine from Russia's invasion. And, to be sure, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is obviously illegal, obviously a policy of, mass death as geopolitics, and it should be criticized as such. But the idea that America was defending Ukrainian democracy by prolonging the war and by pushing Ukraine not to negotiate, and it's really a farce. The real reasons that Ukraine is involved is because they wanted to use Ukraine effectively as a battering ram against Russia, so that Russia would be weakened. And they wrote about it. I mentioned many times on this show this Rand policy paper from 2019 called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. And the idea of it was just ways that the Americans could get Russia to respond and expend a lot of resources. One of them was giving more money to rebels in Syria. That's exactly what they did. One of them was supporting political processes in the Caucasus, in Georgia. That's what they did. Well, but the big one was sending more weapons to Ukrainian rebels so that Russia increases its involvement, which then could lead to an invasion. And that's exactly what they did. And so, this idea of defending Ukrainian democracy should be, really not discussed by serious adults. But this question of using Ukraine geopolitically as a tool against Russia is, I think, what it's all about. And that's what this question of Ukraine and NATO was all about. The U.S. was maintaining a policy of claiming that Ukraine can join NATO. Well, what that means is that NATO troops, NATO missiles, NATO bases could be in Ukraine directly threatening Russia, which, of course, they knew that Russia would never tolerate, which is why it seems to me that they predicted and provoked the invasion into Ukraine. But what's changed since then? Well, why are they seeking or talking about a peace deal now? Well, for one, this was one of Trump's campaign promises. I don't think that he cares too much about his campaign promises on a moral level, let's say, but on a political level, that's obviously important. And he ran saying that we're going to get out of Ukraine. The Biden administration has poured money into this war. Meanwhile, poverty has increased by 67% here at home. Therefore, maybe we shouldn't be sending those resources to Ukraine. That's a very solid political argument, and I think it's fundamentally correct. But as soon as he came into office, he didn't do anything to affect that. There was talks of grand bargain, a grand peace deal, but none of it materialized. None of it happened. So what's really changed? It seems that the Europeans are taking on a greater burden of this war. One of the things that Trump was right about
Mhm.
was that he could convince Europe to take on a greater share of the heavy lifting in Operation Ukraine, and that's what happened. Uh, and it seems that the U.S. is kind of getting tired of it. They see the writing on the wall. They see that the Ukrainian military doesn't have a chance. But now they're actively collapsing with the fall of Pokrovsk, the encirclement of Kupiansk. Like all these places are critical to the Ukrainians, and they're falling. And so finding a way out of this seems to be in everyone's interest. Uh, and Steve Witkoff, one of the lead negotiators for the Trump administration, he's probably the real Secretary of State instead of Marco Rubio. But Witkoff seems to be actively negotiating and seriously taking the steps to address Russian security concerns, and taking a harder stance on Ukraine, so that they accept the deal. This seems to be a positive development. The question is this a peace deal or is this an armistice? So back to your original question. If it's an armistice, that means that it's just a die down in the fighting, but the war and the underlying issues that animate the conflict are still in play. I think North and South Korea right now. They've been in not a peace deal, but an armistice agreement and a non-hot war pact
Mhm.
for the last 80 some years. If that happens, well, then the tensions on the Russian-Ukrainian border will not be solved. Right? It'll be a permanent war zone where that threatens to flare up every second of every day. That's something that the Russians will not tolerate because they're not interested in having a conflict in their near abroad perpetually. I mean, that's exactly what they wanted to avoid by invading Ukraine and by setting the stage for a non-NATOized Ukraine. Um, so if the armistice is the goal, then Russia will never agree to it. If a peace deal is the goal, something that actually addresses the underlying issues, if that's the goal, then I think that we could be very, very hopeful. And the inclusion of no Ukraine in NATO and sovereignty or Russian autonomy in the Donbas regions and Russian sovereignty in Crimea, that indicates to me that there are people who are serious about a serious peace in Ukraine.
Could you
Um,
explain why NATO is so key? Why it is? Um, what number one? What is NATO? I think that as Americans, we are, they're headquartered in Brussels, for heaven's sake, and yet this is our American pole, on the European continent and really around the world. I mean, what is NATO,
all
and
right.
why is it still necessary? I mean, Eisenhower said that this is a 10-year experiment. If we don't, if this exists in 10 years, the experiment would have failed. You know,
Yeah.
So that was what, 70 years ago. So help me. What is NATO? Explain that
Well,
to me.
that was one conception of NATO, right? As
Yeah,
this defensive alliance against against communism and trying to defend against the Warsaw Pact and all that, blah blah blah. Maybe Eisenhower himself believed it. Who knows?
maybe.
But I think the true purpose of NATO was articulated by one of their earlier leaders, Lord Harold Ismay, who said that the
Mm.
purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. It was an alliance designed to ensure American hegemony over Western Europe while excluding the Soviets and the Russians from that security order.
Why? What, I
Why?
mean, what axe do we have to grind with our partners from the Second World War? What's the axe? I mean, help me.
No, well, the axe to grind is that they, like China today, were an alternative to the American system of world domination. The Soviet Union gave aid and assistance to all these countries, um, and they were actively communist, which is something that the Americans and the Nazis were freaking out about in kind of equal measure.
Mhm.
At least before the war. And so the U.S. was not ready to share the world, ready to live in harmony with someone that they consider to be hostile to the entire global domination project. And in fact, the U.S. entered the war with the idea in mind of controlling the global resource field, controlling controlling global resources and trade and economies. Uh, the Cold War was a way to justify continued military expansion, continued intervention, and also to ensure the enrollment of all these countries in the American global political order, the American-led global political order. And so the NATO was one of the ways to ensure that the European side of that stayed in line. And, they said that it was to defend, we have Article 5, an attack on one is an attack against all. No one's really trying to attack NATO. I mean, no one has ever even dreamt of launching an attack on NATO, or no country has, maybe non-state actors. But that's not serious. What NATO did was provide a military and political infrastructure to ensure American influence in places like Germany, France, and all these European countries. Fast forward to after the war, or after the Cold War. In the 90s, the Soviet Union was collapsing, dissolving, and there were a lot of people talking about, well, maybe NATO has outlived its necessity. If its necessity was actually to defend people against a war, well, then yeah, it didn't disband it. There's no reason to continue this military alliance. But the U.S. and the West, they expanded NATO because the goal wasn't defense, it was offense. The goal was to enroll these other countries into NATO and to ensure the expansion of this military political complex, and to ensure that somewhere like Russia, which was being rebuilt in the wake of the Soviet Union, wasn't able to have any sort of resurgence. And so NATO expanded from East Germany, then they got Poland, then they got Hungary, and by 2008 they were looking at Russia, countries that were directly bordering Russia, Georgia and Ukraine. And there was all this discussion about whether or not NATO should keep expanding. The American side, William Burns, who was a Biden CIA director, but under Bush, he was the ambassador to Russia. He sent a cable back from Russia saying, "Niet means niet. Russian red lines on NATO expansion." And he basically explained what I just explained, that no Russian leader would ever accept the idea of a militarized NATO country on their border. And if the U.S. did try to pursue a policy of Ukraine in NATO, then that could cause a civil war or Russia to intervene. This was 2008. And the U.S. has pursued a policy of trying to continue NATO expansion. So this was the design, some sort of conflagration in Ukraine over the border dispute, over the cultural and ethnic divides, and over the NATO question was the design. But now that they're talking about maybe Ukraine won't be in NATO, maybe we'll put that in writing, it means to me that they're trying to find a bookend for this crisis, at least in a serious way. Maybe there are other people in the government, in the Ukrainian and European political systems. Not maybe. I mean, certainly there are people who don't want this fighting to end, who are not seeking a peace deal, but who are seeking a temporary armistice. This is exactly what happened in 2014-15. After the U.S. overthrew the government in 2014, the Ukrainians and Russians and Europeans came together with what were called the Minsk Accords. This was the peace agreement, or this was the armistice agreement that still had a militarized border. There was still conflict, but it was a framework for resolving things. Unfortunately, the Europeans had no interest in actually using that time to resolve things, and they have since said that the goal was to build up, use that 8-year interim to build up Ukrainians' military, so that, like I said, it could be used as a battering ram against Russia. That's exactly what happened. The Russians, in a very real way, fell for it. They fell for the idea that the West was seriously trying to negotiate. They thought it was a peace deal when what they got was an armistice, and they're not going to make that mistake again. And
Well,
so if the Americans are offering a peace deal,
mhm.
they can talk. If they're offering just an armistice, a temporary pause, a freeze of some sorts, then the Russians aren't going to have it, and the war will continue.
Where does China fit into all of this? I mean, this is the world's largest economy, and it is growing. They are on, Russia and China are on friendly terms with Africa, which is, we're entering into the age of the African. Indeed, the 22nd century will be the century of Africa. Uh, Unlike China, unlike Russia, unlike Europe, unlike the United States, what more than 70% of the African continent is 18 and under. And I mean, they're growing in terms of population and they're young. I'm just wondering, I just want to kind of step up and I guess get the 30,000 foot view because we keep looking at, this east west as opposed to the so called north south conflict. And, 'cause that was one of the things that we talked about when you and I met, and Dr. Gibbs and White McKee. Well, what, 3, 4 years ago, that wait a minute, the global south, which is the majority of the world, they have different relationships with these people. So, I mean, is that a factor at all?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the talk about this question of China and how it relates to American policy towards Russia. I mean, it's one of the big things that they're thinking about because, like I said, if America's policy is global domination, then any threat to that needs to be dealt with or handled or at least considered in some geostrategic planning. Well, China is the largest economy in the world by all reasonable measurements, and they've also managed to get there without having an expansive overseas global empire. And they did this without having the IMF give predatory loans to countries. They did this without stationing troops or staging coups, assassinating world leaders. They did this without all of that. The rest of the world sees that, and they think that this might be some alternative to a world order that has been really just a series of endless holocausts under the American auspices. I think that's a very real thing that people around the world are waking up to the idea of, that there is an alternative. And one of the reasons that America pivoted to Asia in the Obama years was because of this very thing. The rise of China, the rise of the Chinese economy, the inability of Western centric capital to overthrow that country's political system. Um, that to me is one of the most crucial things in the minds of American planners. And this is what they write about in their think tank papers, their
Mhm.
policy papers.
But not in the newspapers.
Man, not in the newspaper. Well, occasionally in the newspapers, they'll talk about
Yeah.
how the threat of China is just so important that we got to gear up for war with China in 5 years. Every so often you'll see something like that, but they don't describe it in economic terms like that. Uh, but Russia, of course, borders China, another major country right by China. If Russia and China are close together, well, then that means the front that they can present against the U.S. is all the stronger.
Mhm.
And if you want to fight China, that also means fighting Russia. One of the reasons that the Americans wanted to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia was to weaken Russia so that it's less useful to China. Of course, this had the opposite effect because American planners aren't very smart. This, of course, pushed Russia and China closer together. Uh, and now with the with this they signed all these economic agreements, they signed these military agreements, they've signed all these memoranda of understanding about how they're going to behave towards each other. um, America sees this and they see it as a disaster. One of the reasons that the Trump administration had said that they were interested in seeking peace with Ukraine was because, or a peace in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, was because this gave them more opportunity to focus on China, and
Mm.
that the real war isn't going to be, on the plains and the open fields of Eastern Europe. It'll be in the islands uh, and the naval corridors of the Pacific against China. And America can't do both, and so they want to focus on China. that I think is where Russia looms the most in this equation.
Well, in the last couple of minutes that we have here, what should we be looking out for with Ukraine? I mean, because my question would be, and I think many people would question, as we are struggling with food insecurity. I mean, people are hungry. As people don't have adequate health care, they can't afford it. We're looking at tens of millions of Americans who will be without health care and certainly with reduced health care. Um, I mean, times are really tough in the United States. And yet, we're looking at cutting checks to Argentina, 20 billion, 40 billion, 60 billion. We are spending all of this money on wars, and people are saying, "Wait a minute!" And you have people enlist. You've got payday loan centers bordering these bases because they're not paid enough money. So to what end? So so Marjorie Taylor Greene, quite frankly, and I would say on the right and some people on the left are making the point. And I just think it's important for us to acknowledge wherever people are coming from, they're making the point we cannot afford this. This is unsustainable, Bryce. We're trying to figure out, okay, why we're putting this energy into Ukraine, because we want peace everywhere. We need the money here, Bryce. So what should we be looking out for? Because that energy that's going there, many Americans are saying we need it here.
I mean, what you should be looking out for is the change or continuity in rhetoric about Russia. The Trump administration is talking about, they're talking about peace and they're talking about negotiation, but wait to see if that changes, because Putin has been very clear from the beginning about his willingness to negotiate along the lines that he's very clearly stated for over a decade. But the Americans have vacillated back and forth. And it became very clear, after the war started, that the U.S. was not interested in any sort of negotiation, and that their goal was to prolong the war as long as possible. If that becomes the Trump administration's goal, well, then we're going to see this conflict continue. Ukraine is running out of young men they can send to the meat grinder. They've also been racked by a major corruption scandal that shouldn't have been hard to predict for anyone who has looked at Ukraine. But things aren't good over there. But if the rhetoric doesn't change from the Americans, then it is going to get a heck of a lot worse.
Mm.
That's my prediction. And I think that if there is to be a deterioration of the situation in Ukraine, well, then those peace deals, these peace offerings that the Americans are offering, they're going to mean nothing, right? They're going to mean nothing because Russia will be in a position where they can dictate the terms of their victory. It won't be a peace deal; it'll be a Russian victory, which if the Americans have anything to say about it, this will probably be it could start a hot conflict between the Europeans, who are unaccepting of that outcome, and the Russians, who of course are unaccepting of any alternative. I think these are the things that we should be looking out for. But there's a wide range of possibilities that could happen as a result of these talks. I myself am cautiously optimistic. I do think that there are people who are more sane than others inside of the American government who don't think that Operation Ukraine is worth continuing. I think that can only be positive for Ukrainians, and that can only be positive for Russians. It won't be positive for the neocons, but nothing good for us is good for them.
Well, I mean, the neocons want this conflict. Why? Just very quickly. Why? First of all, who are the neocons? Who are they? What is a neocon? What is a neocon?
The neoconservatives are basically this class of thinking about American power that wants to expand it unabashedly. They nakedly describe themselves as imperialists. This is the political tendency that was really embodied by the late Dick Cheney. He was part of the major neoconservative think tank, the Project for a New American Century, which included people like it was a smorgasbord of ultra Zionists and ultra American, nationalist hawks. People like David Frum, Douglas Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, If these names mean nothing to you, maybe I encourage the audience to look them up.
Mhm.
But the Project for a New American Century was all about rebuilding, quote unquote, America's defenses and maintaining forward-facing bases around the world, maintaining the ability of the American empire to influence any country it wanted militarily, and have no peer or near peer competitor on the world stage. That's essentially the goal of neoconservatism, and also willing to enforce that world order with violence when necessary. That's what the neoconservatives are. And if we look at their position on Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, their goal was to try and break up Russia, to balkanize Russia, turn it into a large gas station that the Americans and the West could get resources from, but could never again become a political counterweight to the West. That's the neoconservative vision, and a lot of it's seeped into everyday American thinking. I mean, you
Mhm.
see plenty average liberals think exactly the same thing these days, but that's a disastrous policy. Anyone who thinks that America should be running the world needs to have their head examined. Either they're very stupid or they're incredibly evil. In either case, no one should be listening to them, because just look at what the effects of that are. The Cost of War project, Brown University, they examine what the costs monetarily and in human lives of these wars are. The neocons took power essentially under the Bush administration, um, the Bush one or Bush two administration after the election of 2000. Since then, since 9/11, the neocon swan song, um, the U.S. empire has contributed to conservatively around 5 million deaths. 5 million deaths, conservatively 50 million displacements.
Mhm.
50 million people displaced. I mean, that's the largest number of displaced people since World War II. And, for 5 million deaths, I mean, that's on the order of magnitude as the Holocaust.
Mhm.
This isn't something that is just in the background, or it's a disagreement among policy. No, I mean, like, they're killing people. Uh, and no one who with of any sanity wants that to continue. And they are the same people who are in charge of Russia policy. Like, it's just Biden's. The character of Victoria Nuland is highly indicative here. Victoria Nuland was, Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor, and then later an ambassador to NATO. But
Mhm.
she later became Obama's undersecretary of Eastern Eurasian Affairs and helped carry out the coup in Ukraine in 2014.
Mhm.
For her role in that, she was actually banned from Russia by the Russians. And so Biden, who wanted to raise tensions with Russia, made her undersecretary for Eastern Eurasian Affairs. I might have that title incorrect, but basically she's at the State Department in charge of the Europe desk. Um, and so in her mission has been to turn Russia into a gas station, has been to harass Russia, NATOize Ukraine, and the consequences be damned. I think people like her who they swap back and forth between Republican and Democrat administration. It's not about the party; it's about the ideology. And
Mhm.
many people on both sides of the aisle agree with her and the rest of the neocons that America needs to be on top. But it's for sane people like us to push back against it.
Bryce Greene at the Green BJ. Please check him out on Substack, on X. If you want to have a fight, go for it. But of course, where else can we check you out, Bryce Greene?
Uh, Twitter is really where I live. I guess I haven't been on in a few days, but I've been busy. But you can find me there. You can find me on Substack. I post there sometimes. And yeah, there are always projects in the pipeline.
All right. We love our Bryce Greene. I am Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. God bless.
God bless.